I think of Hopewell Valley as small towns, groups of people that care a lot about their children and have moved here possibly because of that.
When I think of Hopewell Valley, the things that come to mind are primarily the sort of wide open spaces in between the towns and villages that make up Hopewell Valley.
I've spent so many time on all the ball fields from having my children and my grandchildren that that's a place I like to go.
The one event that changed the face of Hopewell Valley more than any other single thing was the building of the railroad.
The railroad station is one of my places that I have a soft heart for because, as I say, we did live there. I think I'm luckier for knowing the real parts of Hopewell. I saw in the New York Times that Hopewell is as close to Vermont, a Vermont town as you can get without being there.
I live in Hopewell Borough, and I have to say I really like Hopewell Borough itself.
There's a certain sort of peaceful tranquility.
Just it's a place you can walk around, lots of side streets and so on, and it's a pleasant place to walk around in.
I think those are sort of my favorite vistas.
A lot of people think of New Jersey as being cities and lots of smelly areas, or the question is when you're asked, what exit off the turnpike, and Hopewell is nothing like that.
Well, Pennington today is very similar to Pennington of, say, 100 years ago. Pennington was sort of expanded at that time to become more of a suburban community. Prior to that, many of the families that lived in Hopewell Valley and lived in Pennington worked in Hopewell Valley and Pennington. Commuting was not an easy thing to do. It was time-consuming. But as soon as the railroad came, and it was really a direct link between Philadelphia and New York City, it was at that point that people started to realize that they had easy access. There was a group of primarily entrepreneurs and business people who had lived in and were from New York City. And when the railroad came, they realized that it was really a very short train ride to get from New York City to Hopewell Valley. People are able now to commute by rail.
I used to go to Philly as a teenager. I guess now they go to the mall. I could go to Philly because I could get on the train, get off at the Market Street station, shop all I wanted, get back on the train and come right back home to within walking distance of my house on Broad Street.
Businessmen decided that what they wanted to do was to construct this rail line, very first rail line, to connect these two cities. So they had to go to the state for a charter to allow them to do this. As part of that process, they asked the New Jersey State Legislature to give them the exclusive right. In other words, they were the only company that would be chartered to cross the state of New Jersey for a period of 50 years. So the Camden and Amboy built their railroad, and the name was later changed to the Pennsylvania Railroad, and they had the exclusive right to run all freight traffic and all passenger traffic diagonally across the state for a period of 50 years. As the 50-year sort of monopoly started coming to a close, another group of entrepreneurs and businessmen decided that it was time for a little competition. It was time for them to construct a railroad that would run almost parallel across the state to connect the same two major metropolitan areas, and that being New York and Philadelphia.
So it's still in the landscape if you know where to look at it. I mean, if you look at aerial photographs, you can see pretty clearly still where that line used to run. Well, first thing would be Jacobs Creek Road, which is laid down on top of the old railroad bed of the Mercer and Somerset. There's the old station in Pennington on West Delaware Avenue. There's odd little culverts here and there.
There's that really rather nice abutment, isn't there, on Scotch Road.
Yeah.
This is a pretty good example of railroads being built not purely for economic purposes, or rather to destroy the ability of the competitor to run an economically viable railroad. So the railroads could be planned, railroad lines could be planned, which the company that built them knew perfectly well would never really be economic, but they would stop the other company. It was very free-for-all,
right.
Wild, which is why there are so many railroads, all over the countryside, partly because of that.
In an effort to protect their monopoly and to protect their investment, the Pennsylvania Railroad made a legal attempt to block the second company from construction of their railroad. Construction began, and crews of men started laying the track, and the rail line would run from Yardley across the river to West Trenton, and from West Trenton on through the township of Ewing and into Hopewell Township, with a station at Pennington and a station at Hopewell, and on up to points north, Belmead and Millstone, and ultimately to Bound Brook, New Jersey. The Pennsylvania Railroad, the original company, began to get nervous that they were about to lose their monopoly, and with all legal options attempted, with no result, the Pennsylvania Railroad decided that the only way to block the competing railroad was to physically block them.
The Mercer and Somerset did all they could to try and prevent that from being installed, to which the response of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad was to actually park a train right on the frog once it was installed, so that the other line couldn't be used.
This engine was placed in that location to block the actual construction, but of course they were still in operation. So the process was that this blocking engine, if you will, upon the approach of an oncoming scheduled train, would back up onto a siding out of the way, and just enough time to allow the oncoming train to go by. And as soon as they would go by, the engineer on the blocking engine would pull back onto his spot to prevent the approach of this oncoming work. On the evening of January 5th, 1876, the physical laying of a crossing between one railroad to the other was about to be built. And in the language of railroading, that crossing would be called a frog. Approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on January 5th, in the dead of winter, with a train approaching, the blocking engine was instructed to back out of the way, as it had been doing for the previous week and a half, to allow the oncoming train to come by. As that happened, a crew of workmen working on behalf of the Delaware and Raritan Railroad emerged from the woods with heavy chains and spikes, and literally chained the blocking engine in place on the rail so that it could not move back into place and block the construction of the frog. Tempers began to flare. The frustrated engineer of the blocking engine could not do the job he was assigned to do. The workers who had been there to sort of assist in this were able to communicate the message to the railroad company to the north that this event had occurred and that they needed to send another engine to the rescue to take up that location to block the frog. So the largest, fastest engine was dispatched from points north, Somerset, and at a very high rate of speed, the engineer, under orders from his boss to get there as soon as possible, fired up the engine and proceeded to this location outside of Hopewell as fast as he possibly could. One could imagine the scene in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the winter, with most of the countryside at home, sleep in bed. And here is this amazing scene. You could imagine lit by lanterns and perhaps torchlight, this huge engine straining at its chains to get out of its way, men shouting.
There were no actual fatalities.
Was there actually some fight? I don't know, I presume there was actually some bit of fisticuffs and fighting and
sure.
brawling and things, but no fatalities. And
And as the blocking engine had been secured so they could not move, another crew of some 500 men again emerged from the woods with their equipment, rails, railroad ties, ready to build this frog as quickly as possible before the engine could get itself unrestrained or the rescuing engine would approach on the scene to take his place. As the time progressed and the workmen were busily ripping up the rails of the competing railroad, the approaching train appeared, and it was clear that it would no longer be possible for them to block the spot because the rails had in fact been pulled by that time. And so in a desperate effort to stop this action, the engineer of the rescuing train on the Mercer and Somerset Railroad decided to stoke up the engine and proceed full steam ahead with whistles blaring and smoke billowing from its track, from its smokestack, broke its way through an immense wooden barricade that had been constructed with railroad ties flying, came onto the scene, and of course the rails were gone. He immediately went off the tracks and crashed into a mud embankment and came to a rest in a ditch alongside the railroad track.
as far as I know, there's absolutely no sign of the actual frog crossing itself.
I don't believe so.
No, it's just east of Van Dyke Road,
Right,
isn't it?
right.
But you go, well, you can't really walk along the railroad, but it's you can't really, as far as you can tell, there isn't anything to see. I think one nice thing is the name of it, because it immediately, even though you know what it really refers to, it always sort of summons up images of animals, frogs.
It does.
Now I know it's where we got the mascot for our Hopewell Elementary School is Freddie the Frog, and he was named after the Frog War because of the history of the Frog War. Yes, it was hard to explain to the whole school at a time, but they drew a picture of the cross tracks and tried to explain that that's called a frog in railroad terms.
There's the gazebo there, the bandstand. Right. It has a nice little weather vane on the top, and that has a frog on it too. Yeah.
And the kids picked up on that, and Freddie the Frog was declared the mascot of Hopewell Elementary.
No idea about that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we have now Freddie the Frog as our mascot. He's on our writing paper, on the flags that fly, and T-shirts, of course.
Wow, nice story.
It is. We need to celebrate it somehow. I mean, there needs to be an annual sort of walk of the Mercer and Somerset route, culminating in some gunshots or something.
Yeah.